Blender for Noobs.
Hello, this is Dan Nobles and welcome to Blender for Noobs and welcome back to part 5, the final part of creating the zombie character using MakeHuman, Blender, and your favorite graphics program. Before we get started, something that I noticed in some tests that I did is this flannel shirt, when I rendered it, looks like it just came off the rack at Walmart or something. It looks brand new. So I think what I want to do is I'm going to go into the shirt material or texture, and I'm going to add another layer, and I'm just going to call this dirty texture, and grab your paintbrush, and you want to make, just get a soft paintbrush, make it kind of large like this, and just add a little bit of smudge to the shirt just to dirty it up a little bit, because I noticed it was, it's way too clean for a zombie shirt. Just kind of randomize the smudges across here. And don't forget your color as well. And once you've done that, just take down the opacity a little bit. It's kind of hard to see here, but I'm going to go with something like 28%, see how that works. And then you want to go and do the same thing with the jeans texture, but let me go ahead and save this. Save as, and I'm going to use the same PNG and save over my shirt texture modified, because that's the one I'm using as the texture. Okay, and then just like I said, just go into your jeans texture and do the exact same thing if you want to make it a little bit more smudgy. Okay, back in Blender, the first thing that we need to do here is we need to fix these pants. So I'm just going to tab into edit mode here, turn my proportional editing back on, enable it, and I'm going to turn on occlude geometry here. And just go in here and start grabbing some of these areas here and pulling it outward. And maybe downward a little bit. And you can even use G here to grab and move around, might be a little bit easier. Okay, and just make that look a little bit normal. Also, I noticed up here some of my pants textures wasn't showing through, and if you don't have these pulled out, then you're not going to see the belt loops and things like that on your texture. And of course on mine I never really finished the back part of it, but that's okay, just to save time. Okay, so that's probably a little bit better what we had. Turn this back off, turn occlude back off, and tab back into object mode. I'm just going to do another save. And now we are actually ready to do some posing on our zombie. So if you go into one of these handles here and just click on it, it'll automatically go into pose mode. And then I'm going to hit 1 on my numpad and R to rotate. That way you can kind of change the look of the zombie. And as we know, zombies like to have their arms going outward because they're always trying to grab somebody to eat them. Grab this one as well, pull it down, Control 3 on the numpad, R, move that up. And maybe even grab this handle here, go into top view, just kind of move him over a little bit, and maybe even this one a little bit. And then we can grab this leg here, go into 3 side view, R rotate, rotate that one a little bit. It's like he's kind of walking, sort of, as much as a zombie can. Okay, and you'll notice when you move, or you may notice when you move your armature here, some of the material may start deforming again, and you may have to pull some of that out, depending on the pose that you want. Okay, so I'm going to do that for now. Looks alright. Go ahead and save this again. And now what we're going to do is we are going to create our final image using Compositing. Before I do that, let me go over to our settings here under our render settings. And I'm doing my final render at 1920 by 1200. That's really big, but that's the type of resolution I want for my background image. And my samples right now, I'm just going to use 10, just so when I take my test renders, it'll go really quick. And another thing that you can do to quicken up your test renders is just bump this size down to 25% or something. In fact, yeah, I'll leave mine at 100 right now, see how it goes. Okay, so what I'm going to do is go into Compositing now, and I'm going to change this from default to Compositing. And if you go into the Compositing, this is probably what you'll see to begin with, except you're not going to see all these nodes here that I created. So what you want to do is you want to choose to use nodes, and let's go ahead and do an F12 to render our image. And one thing I forgot to do is set the camera up the way I want it. So I'm going to go back into default here and just select the camera, and let's go 7 top view, R rotate, G move, 3 side view, bring this down a little bit, 1 front view, rotate, and G move this, G, Z, Z, move it outward a little bit. And I want to zoom in a little bit because I want to get at least some of the details of the zombie. And let's see, do I really want that view? Maybe something like this. It's really up to you how you want to show the angle. I'm going to try something like this. And it also has a lot to do with what kind of background image you get. You could take like a picture of your house and put him in front of your house or something. Or if you have a view that is looking up, you may want to change the camera so you're looking up at the zombie. On mine, I have a sort of an image of a barn that I'm going to use as the background. So I don't want to change the camera as far as the side view. I don't want to tilt it up too much because it'll make the image in back not look correct. But you'll see what I mean here in a second, hopefully. So go ahead and save again. And go back into Compositing. And what I've done here is I've created a node tree for the Compositing that gets close to the final image that I want it to be. And I'll just go through these one by one just to show you what you need to do. Some of these you won't need to use at all, and I'll point those out. So don't panic if you see all these nodes and just go oh my god, what is this stuff here. It's just basically what I've come up with to create my final image. So I'm going to start with this image, and you just do a Shift A to create all of these nodes. And for this image, you want to do an input and choose image. And you want to go find your image that you're using for the background. In my case, because I'm doing a 1920 by 1200 image, that's the size I made that image. It's best if you can keep your background image the same as your render resolution. So I'm going to go into my reference images, and I got this barn image. Okay, so there's the barn image. Now what you need to do with this image, because you're going to use it as a background image, there's a few things we need to do to make this work, but very important, go into your render settings and you want to check transparent here. Go into your render layers and uncheck use environment. And then we need to make this actually a background image. So don't worry about this brightness and hue saturation yet and this blur. Really add one of these alpha overs, and so Shift A, and under color you'll see alpha over, so add that in there. And let me go ahead and do an F12 render. Okay, and you'll see right now that our zombie is not showing up correctly because I had this alpha over muted. All these red areas here, it means that the node is muted. All you need to do to mute something or unmute is hit M, and it toggles between mute and unmute. You'll see if I unmute it, he shows up in our image there. Another thing that I need to explain here is you can use the backdrop and it'll show up pretty much under your node tree, but I find that really distracting to work with the nodes and see that image back there. So I usually turn this off, and what I do is I come down to a window here, and you can change this to use the viewer node. And in order to get your viewer node, you have to have this node over here, the viewer. So you do a Shift A and you want output. You want both a composite and a viewer output. So create both of those, and then we're going to hook those up in a bit here. So once you have your, let's go back to this image, once you have your alpha over, make sure you run this alpha string up to the factor. And let me see what I made the factor because I forget. 0.5 is the factor. So run that into the factor there. Okay, your image, for getting all of this right now, just go directly in to the image here on the alpha over. And from this alpha over image here, you can run this directly into the composite and the viewer. Just run two of them directly to it, and don't worry about any of the stuff that I have here. And that should at least give you something that when you hit F12 you can go ahead and render and see your image. But you do want to see, of course, your render layer, so you should have a render layer. This is another input. So if you don't have one, Shift A and look under input and choose render layer. And that'll be basically the scene that you have here. Okay, and then run that render layer directly in to another image, the other image port here. And then once you render, you should have a background and also your zombie showing up, which is basically if I render that's what I'm getting right now. Okay, I had to pause a little bit here because my viewer wasn't coming in correctly. It wasn't showing up. I don't know what happened, but just some kind of bug, because all I did was take the viewer node, move it over to here and hook it up, and it started working, then put it back exactly where it was, and it started working again. So anyway, so now we have our viewer node here, so we can see what we're doing. And now that we can see the viewer, as you can see, if I choose backdrop, you can see the image in the background. Now, if you do like to work with the image in the background here, what you'll probably want to do, instead of zooming these sometimes, you want to zoom the image. You can do that by choosing V on your keyboard. So if I choose V, it'll just zoom out, and if I do an Alt V, it'll zoom in. Okay, other thing you may notice here is, see how the legs are cut off here? That's due to the size that I'm rendering at, but that's just basically the viewer node. The composite node, when you do an F12 render and you get your final render, will actually look like how you have your camera set up here, so don't worry too much about that. Probably a way to fix that where it shows up correctly here. If anybody knows a good way to correct that, please comment on there. But I'm going to go ahead and turn my backdrop off, so be easier to see some of this. And I'm just going to go through these and let you know what I did to change this final image. And hopefully we'll be able to see some of these changes as we go along. Okay, first thing I did is added a bright contrast, so Shift A. And I'm not going to go through Shift A on all of these. Basically, you can pretty much hunt around for it. If you go here and you type in search, you can find the node that you need. But under color, there's bright contrast. So I turned down the brightness on this quite a bit, -35. And just to let you know, as you can see, we're looking at the background image here. This is not affecting our render image. Okay, so I'm going to hit M to unmute this, and you can see that I've darkened the background quite a bit. I kind of wanted this to be at night and didn't want that sky in there, but I fiddled around with inverting the color and things like that, but it didn't quite turn out the way I wanted to. But the final render I'm pretty happy with. So next thing I did was I added a hue saturation value, and notice that they're just plugged in image to image. So I'm going to M to unmute this. And what I did is I took down the saturation quite a bit to get some of the color out of there. And then for hue, I have the 0.5 and values stayed at 1. And I also added a blur and made it a fast Gaussian blur. So I'm going to unmute this. If you look at the background here when I unmute this, it just blurs up the background a little bit, makes it a little bit more realistic, and I have these values at X3 and Y3. Okay, so that's pretty much all I did for the initial background image. So let's look at our render layer, our actual zombie here. I did the same thing. I added some brightness contrast, took the brightness down to -14. So let's unmute this. And you can see it also affected the background a little bit, but it darkened our zombie quite a bit. Hue saturation, kind of the same thing. I took the saturation down. And you can see that now our zombie, instead of being really as flesh colored as he was, even though we tried to make him kind of gray in the texturing, this really helps get more of a gray look or a less fleshy look, I guess, less colorful look. And also added a little bit of blur to him as well. Just did a X2 and Y2. And then we get to this area where the alpha over is. And what I've done here is I've added some, let's see what we should do first. I think we should probably do the noise first. When you look at this image and you render it at the resolution, the high resolution that I'm going to render it at, it comes out very, very plain looking, really too plain looking. Like this. I mean, if you look at this image and you look at the zombie, you think, okay, well, that's a 3D model. It's not that great looking. So you need to add some noise to it. In fact, you need to add the noise to the whole image. So that's why this stuff is occurring here. See, we got our render layer doing its changes. We have our background doing its changes. And then we're coming into here, and everything here affects both of those images. So let's start with what I did with the texture. So on the texture, what you need to do is come over to your textures, and it really doesn't matter where you put this, but let me see if I can select the zombie here, go back to our zombie textures. So right on the zombie skin, what I did is come over to textures, and we just want to do a new texture, and let's name this noise. And you can either use the noise texture, or what I do is I end up using a clouds texture. And the only reason for that is because it seems to give me a little bit more more options here. And I'm just going to leave this grayscale, leave it soft, come down to the size and make it the smallest that you can make it, 0.0001. And I'm going to change this to use cell noise. And let's see how that looks now. It's going to come over here. Once you have your texture here, you can drop this down. And if you created a noise texture there, you called it noise, you can just select it there. And I'm going to unmute that and let it composite. So we don't see too much right now, but that's because I've done some stuff here. The noise in Blender, I'm not, maybe, there's better ways to do it. I'm not too happy with how it looks. I mean, basically what we want to do with the noise is we want to get a grainy film kind of look. So what I ended up doing is I added some despeckle and some blur to this. And on the despeckle, here's the values for this. And I'm just going to unmute that. And also for the blur, I used a Gaussian blur and variable size and just made this 8x8. Let's unmute that. And then I also, in order to get, I didn't like the white noise that it was given. So what I did is I changed this. This is basically a mix. If we go to Shift A, go to color, choose a mix, create a mix like this, and you can change it to divide like that. That's how I made that divide. So let's X that one. And left it at it, or made it a factor of 0.1. So let's unmute that. Okay, and just wondering why I wasn't seeing anything here, but I had to go look at my notes how I did it in the test image. And what I actually used for the texture was not what I showed you. Let me go back to that texture. Let's see. Okay, so you got to go back and find your texture, your noise texture. And I did not use clouds. What I did is I used distorted noise. And I did make it a 0.0001. And I used cell noise here, and I also used cell noise here. And when you do that, you'll notice that you get this kind of bumpy look, textury look on the zombie, which I think kind of helps it. And then you can't really see it too much, but it's also affecting the background image. You can kind of see it in the sky here as well, but it gives kind of an interesting look. And you can play around with these threshold settings on the despeckle and even some of the blur settings to get the kind of look that you want. But I thought that looked a little bit better than just the plain soft texture that was coming out. And you can also kind of look at the differences of how this looks. If you zoom in, let's zoom in on the face here and scroll up a little bit. And if we mute these, mute those there, and probably even the divide one. Then you can see that basically you have just a, that smooth look on the skin, and just doesn't look very interesting at all. And I think this just adds so much more to it. Okay, so that would basically be probably, you can go ahead and do a final render there. Something else that I did just to give it an interesting look is I added this tone map, and I used the RD photoreceptor, and these are the settings that I added on there. I also added an RGB curve, and I just changed the green value a little bit. I think that's the only one to change, yeah. And just to give it some like interesting kind of artistic look. So if I unmute this one and it recomposites, then you'll see we got more of like a contrast look. And let's unmute this one. And just, a different way to get different looks on your final render. But the one I went with is basically with those two muted. And then of course, like I said, you want to end up with your final image going out to the composite node. That's the output. That's going to actually give you your F12 render. But I usually, some people seem to like, they move around. They work under the viewer node and then they add the composite node at the final stage and then do the render. But I think it's just as easy to add both of these into both of them, just so you can work on your viewer node and also have the ability to get your final render. Okay, so then once we got that, I'm going to do a quick save. And I know this is a lot of nodes here that I went through, but if you follow this tree, and you can also begin to play around with some of these settings, make your image look pretty much how you want it to look. Just feel free to test out these nodes, see what they do, because I mean there's a lot there, a lot to understand, and I'm by no means a node genius, so I'm still learning myself and probably will always be trying to learn these nodes. So I'm going to go back to our default scene view. Nope, not game logic. Default. Okay, and then we can do a final render. Just going to do a control up arrow and render. And there's our final image. And you'll notice I rendered this at just 10 samples. So I mean, it's not really bad just using 10 samples for this. Of course, an image this size, you're going to see some jagged, pixelation there, but all you need to do is just bump it up to 100 or 500 and it should look fine. The nice thing about the background image is it's already an image, so it doesn't have to render all that out. So I hope you enjoyed this Blender for Noobs zombie tutorial. Please comment, subscribe, and if you end up using this and create your own zombie look and final render image, I'd love to see it. I want to see, I know you guys can come up with some stuff that is like really outrageous and a lot better than what I can do. So really interested to see what you come up with. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.